I'm Alexandra, and I am in Richmond, Virginia. Hi, Marilyn from Chicago. Emily from Pennsylvania, Waynesburg. Welcome. I'm going to let a few more people get in. Hi, Nancy from Texas.
Welcome, everybody.
So we can go to so I'm Alexandra, Chief Program Officer. We have our returning guest who's been doing this wonderful series for us. I'll let her introduce herself and tell a little bit more about herself. And in the background, we have Jahira uh, being our tech support. So I want to tell her thank you. Hi, Heather from Texas. Thanks for joining us. So next slide, please. So today we are super excited to have Yoli back with us, and we're going to talk about accessing our emotions, exploring rhythm, time, and the natural world. This is class number 5 in her series, and it's the joy of grief. Next slide. So for those of you who are new and those of you who come every day, you know that we would like you to create a safe space, and one of the ways we do that is the way that we engage. So if you're talking when you've had your hand raised and you're not talking, please put your hand on mute. If you're ready to comment and you actually want to join the conversation, raise your hand. We'll unmute you, and then you can unmute yourself to be heard. We ask that you please be patient with us. Sometimes when the chats, they come really fast, so we have to kind of catch up. And then make sure again that when you're typing your comments in the chat that it says to all panelists and all attendees. Hi, Tammy. Nice to see you. Hi, Sophia. I hope I pronounced your name from all the way from Honduras. Welcome.
Love it.
So you'll see people already putting agree. This is how we make sure again that this is the added thing that we do to make sure there's a safe space and we all have a great time learning from each other. So first we want to speak from our own experience. We want to use I statements. We want to use the golden rule. We want to treat others the way we would like to be treated. And last but not least, we want you to bring your full presence, no multitasking. If you need a break, take a break. Try to bring your full presence so we can learn, share, and grow together. If you agree to these agreements, please, as you see other people are already doing, type I agree in the chat. Hi, Maria from Washington State. Next slide. And next, we're going to turn it over to our presenter today. Thank you, Yoli.
Thank you. So, thank you all of you that have come today and who have just agreed to be in this space and introduced ourselves. It's really fun to get to spend a lunch time with you, a midday time, just immersing ourselves in some practices that are just so helpful for balancing our emotions, for expressing our emotions. I know I was in these days I can't remember what conversation was had in what space, because it's all happening online. But one of those conversations in the last few days, and I had a chance to just reflect on the need to express emotion, right? And so even just as we were getting prepared for today's class and getting, our kind of team set and ready on, just like, what's the point of this only being theoretical? Like, let's talk about expressing our emotions. Like, no, actually, we need to be able to access them, express them, and not just in like heated moments where we feel totally out of control. I will say though that sometimes those moments are also important. Right. So just saying that, like, this, I know in this whole series, I haven't given any space for your questions. And some of you have been coming to these classes multiple times, which I love, or you've been going back and finding a recording from the other 4 parts of the series. We have been building a practice. Today we're going to add the last couple pieces into our whole practice. These slides are really helpful for you to go back to get references, but also to just reinforce that I'm actually giving basically an introduction to the very sort of basic philosophy of Chinese medicine, also called East Asian medicine, because it's not just limited to China and then like Chinese diaspora, but also these ideas travel. They travel to Indonesia, they travel to Korea, they travel to Japan. So we really call this East Asian medicine. And this, where we're jumping in, our access point on this really is about nature, rhythm, cycles, time, right? And that when we are out of rhythm is when we experience the most distress. Distress can be in the form of emotional distress. Distress can be in the form of disease. Distress can be in the form of chronic conditions. It can be in the form of extreme fatigue, right? Trauma is a form of distress as well. Um, I also gave like zero, any of these webinars, zero background on who I am and what I do. But like, you can just find me on the internet. You know, I got like 8,000 bios around. I got a whole resume on my website. You go to yogawithyoli.com and call it a day. Because really, I just want this time that we have together to be about these practices and this deep human emotional experience of grief. And so one of the subtitles of this whole series is grief as a superpower, because we don't live in a cultural context right now that tells the story of grief as something that you would want to engage. In fact, something that is your friend. And so, in many ways, we are befriending grief as we explore 5 aspects of grief. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Today, culminating in the fire phase, up at the top there, in the joy of grief. So, our journey began at the metal phase, in the sorrow, or just grief itself, the grief of grief. And then we traveled. You can kind of see there's 2 shapes here. There's the pentagon when we look at the lines around the outside from each of what looks like elements, but up top we see that these are phases. I'll get to that. And then we see that there's lines traced on the inside. So let's follow that inside track. We started at metal phase, the sorrow of grief, the grief of grief, right? Then we travel to wood, the anger of grief. To earth, the worry of grief. Down to water, the sorrow, sadness, and also fear of grief. And that culminates in this journey, this cyclic journey with fire phase, the joy of grief. And that could be like really deep to ponder. What on earth could even be meant by the joy of grief? What is an expression of the joy of grief, right? Even if you're just asking yourself that question right now, like what could be the joy of grief? Now, grief is our emotional response to loss. And we experience loss at many, many junctures in life, not just the loss of a loved one or loss we may be experiencing in the death of a, a beloved pet, a person, a teacher, a mentor, a parent, a cousin, a child, right? We're also talking about the grieving that we experience collectively, intergenerationally, culturally, the grieving that we experience in the transition and loss from relationships, jobs, housing, the loss of our own aging process, our sense of beauty or desirability, right? This grief thing actually hangs out with us a lot in life. Perhaps if we had the time and space to really think about it, grief may be one of the most prominent and significant emotional experiences we have in our whole lifetimes. Problem is, grief has been the expression of grief, and the experience of grief has both been made into a taboo, something that's just frowned upon and should be kept behind closed doors and not expressed and not experienced with others, except that that is entirely an oppressive idea, because when we look at and experience grief in multitudes of other cultures and indigenous cultures, what we find is that grief has a prominent seat at the table. It's welcomed, it's encouraged. We do it in solitude. We also grieve with others, and that's very important. And we grieve cyclically. We celebrate death anniversaries just like we celebrate birth anniversaries, right? So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So in September, I offered a webinar. Was that the September or October? I offered a webinar in this series that explored this axis, AXIS, of fear and joy. That these are two parts of a critical and important spectrum experience of being a human. That it's like core human experience, this movement between sorrow and joy. So I want to kind of come back to some of the themes we explored in that webinar and encourage you to go find it in the catalog and watch that one again. It might make a lot more sense now that we've gone through all 5 phases through an introduction. But one of the things I've been incorporating in these webinars is poetry, because poetry is expression of life, and poetry supports us in how we process emotion, thought, and emotion. And so I wanted to bring in a little something here from a well-known spiritual teacher named Osho, and these were some of his quotes, some of his words. Sadness gives depth. Happiness gives height. Sadness gives roots. Happiness gives branches. Happiness is like a tree going into the sky, and sadness is like the roots going down into the womb of the earth. Both are needed. And the higher a tree goes, the deeper it goes simultaneously. The bigger the tree, the bigger will be its roots. In fact, it's always in proportion. That's its balance. So it's just kind of bringing us into this idea that the joy exists because the sorrow exists, and vice versa. The sorrow exists because the joy exists. So let's go to the next slide. So remember, I asked you to start pondering what on earth could be this joy of grief. What could that be? So we've looked at this slide several times, and we like this slide because it gives us color and movement, and it shows us a process. This is the classic 5 steps of the grief process, starting with that shock, panic, denial, that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, moment, and then starts this cyclic movement through common emotional experiences of rage and anger, depression and shame and stigma, recovery, guilt, acceptance, and then I want to highlight the roots and the branches, the empathy and hope, and the joy and love, this access. Let's go to the next slide. So we're just kind of cruising through. So we're back with this 5 elemental model, and that's going to help us bring ourselves into this embodied experience. So again, what could be some of the experiences of the joy of grief? So one of the things that comes to my imagination is the when we have the loss of a loved one and we go through the cyclic processes, the emotions that arise, and we come to the potential of a very simple realization that we are living, right? That there is a life to be lived. And sometimes we think about it, particularly with the loss of a loved one, that, well, what would that person really want us to do? Would they want us to stay in anger, worry, sorrow, sadness, fear? Or would they want us to live the enriched, joyous, pleasureful life that lay before us, right? So that's one common interpretation of the joy of grief. But I also think of the interpretation of the joy of grief in wanting to live. The fire, the spark, right? Like kind of feel into the element itself, the fire. And you can see up here that we have 4 organ networks or energy networks of the body that are associated with the fire phase. The fire phase is pretty significant to the human experience, right? And so here we have the heart, the pericardium, which is the fluid-filled space around the heart organ. It's the heart protector. We have the small intestine as well as something called the triple burner, which in this system is related to our metabolic balance or metabolic function, our temperature gauge, right? So we can see that fire has a lot to do with, in this system, boundaries. And we have 4 layers of boundaries. So boundaries are like really important. How we interface with others, and then a little bit more intimate and a lot more intimate. And then the heart is the empress, is the emperor. It's the ruler of this body system, and it is the most important part. And so it's the most protected. It has, in fact, these 3 layers of fiery boundaries all around it. Now, when we are again looking at this system here, we see that when we go around the outside, we have a relationship of these phases. And that's called the creation cycle, that fire creates earth, and earth produces metal, and metal shapes water. And water nourishes wood, and wood feeds fire, right? And then we see this control cycle. And these words are really curious as well. They're of the natural world experience, that fire melts metal, metal cuts wood, wood holds earth. Think those roots. Earth, what's this little word here? Like, get a little dry in my contact lenses, right? So earth constrains water. Think like riverbank, right? That's earth holding water, right? Constrains water, and water douses fire, right? It puts out fire. So thinking about, again, one more time, that axis of water and fire. Too much sorrow, too much fear, too much sadness douses fire, right? Too much anger, wood, can maybe make fire too big, right? Little singeing, right? So we know that fire is both creative and destructive. Think forest fire. We see the forest fire destroying the forest. What we then see long term is that the fire is regenerative to the wood. So this system provides us with so many ways of looking at both outer nature, but also then the same design in this body itself. And one more thing I just want to say here is I'm calling them phases. You're not hearing me call these 5 elements because what this diagram and this system is communicating is actually moments in time. And I think that's so important when we're thinking about grief, that grief isn't a one-time experience. So no matter if we're looking at this diagram or the figure 8 diagram of the classic stages of grief, really, grief is cyclic. We don't stay in any one phase or experience of grief, just like we don't stay in one aspect of these 5 phases here. This represents the whole 24-hour clock. This also represents the seasons, right? Times of day, right? So let's go to the next slide. So this linear form is kind of helpful because here's our correspondences. So we have 2 columns to look at here, absolute fire and supplemental fire. And so when we're looking at heart and small intestine of the absolute fire, I've explained this also in earlier webinars, the idea of these being energy channels in the body. What we're saying is that these organs are a part of the energy channel, but it's not just only the organ. Because in fact, we can find the heart channel in other places in the body other than specifically around the heart muscle, right? Which is then how we use this as acupuncture points and massage channels like this in application. Okay, so we're back in this absolute fire column. Now let's see some other very important things. You can see times of day. You can see this is the season of summer, the color associated red. You can see the tongue speech is a part of this. So speaking your truth, speaking your joy, the way you express and communicate the joy of grief is really critically important. So again, what could be the joy of grief? What else could this be? It could be the ways that we celebrate, the stories that we tell, the sort of tales of the adventures, where and we experienced the unpleasant feelings and pleasant feelings. I also think of the ways that we honor grief through music, song. I particularly think about like the second line, right? Has anybody ever seen a second line or a video of a second line? So it's a grief, a collective grief practice from some of the diasporic cultures of Louisiana, those Creole cultures, where the second line, like you come out of the church, like you had the church service, and then you got people, you got the whole big brass band, and then you got a couple kind of dancers, there's parasols involved, and somebody's gonna be holding a picture of the recently deceased, and the second line starts real slow, and it kind of has this kind of like a little bit jerky dance movements to them, it's solemn, it's solemn, it's a little bit like flexed movements, and then as the second line goes in the street and as it picks up momentum and as the music picks up momentum, by the end of this parade will be a joyous, raucous, like full power brass band experience. So I just think like that is the perfect example of the joy of grief, where we start in the sorrow, heaviness, and we build. And there's a speech component, there's a communication component, and it builds and it builds and it builds and it expresses and expresses, and expresses, and it has somewhere to go because the nature of this energy is up expansion. It's actually expansion in all directions. Right? So think of like the whirling dervish, the circular cyclical movements, the just like raucous dance party that follows the funeral. Like that's the expression of the joy of grief. Not limited to, but certainly the possibility of, right? So, what's our key expression? Laughter, right? We could do some laughter yoga in this one. We could do all sorts of things. Now, if you just pop over to the supplemental fire, you'll see a lot of the same things, right? So we had our heart constrictor, meaning the pericardium, the heart protector, again, this triple heat, this metabolic function. And then we also head on down, we'll see some of the same things of joy, the emotion of joy, the expression of laughter, the direction being all around. And I want to point out this one feeling as well, the manner of melancholy, right? That the joy of grief can be also a reflective, pensive experience. So for some of us, let's go to the next slide. For some of us, this is like the idea that there's a joy of grief may be a completely revolutionary idea. And so what I really want to encourage you to do is the joy of grief is not separate from any of the other emotions that we experience when we access grief. It's one of the possibilities. So I include this slide just to kind of help us conceptualize these channels, this movement of energy that we want to create in the body, because grief can feel so heavy, so constricted, so stuck. And many of us will be stuck in cycles of grief until the cycle's complete. So what we're looking for here is support. The practices that I've shared with you throughout this webinar series, their intention has all been to be supportive, to access these core feelings of grief and anger, worry, sadness, and joy. And also that grief needs support to cycle. And there won't be one cycle of grief. We will continue to cycle. It's a sacred spiral walk. We will continue to cycle, visit, and revisit grief experiences throughout our lifetime. I'm happy to tell you this today, that you're never finished grieving. And why I'm happy to tell you this today is because every time you revisit that experience, that timestamp, and where do the timestamps live? They live in these channels, this rainbow body that you're looking at. And they all come to a juncture all the channels come to a meeting place in the belly itself, right? And so the reason I'm happy to share with you that you never stop grieving is because every time you revisit the experience, you get more and more powerful. You actually gain more of yourself. It's a masterful, paradoxical experience that is grief as a superpower. So let's go to the next slide. We've been learning a practice that balances all 5 phases in the body. This is a wonderful practice to do every day of your life. This is a wonderful practice to do for anything that ails you. And for simply just being a human being, having a human experience in this earth itself. I want to just give a little reminder. If you have questions that have been building throughout the series or just today's class as well, pop them into the chat. Alexandra's going to help us kind of grab some of those, capture some of those questions, and I'm doing my best to save a few minutes for at the end of today's class for a few questions. I know some of your questions may really center around like the actual performance of these movements, and I want you to know that these movements are suggestive. So I'm going to give a few variations for some of these to make them a little bit more body accessible for all bodies. I also want you to consider, and I know maybe some of you are practitioners of Chinese medicine or students of Chinese medicine or have done Tai Chi or something like this, but I want you to think that what we're trying to get from these movements is activation of fascial planes of the body, meaning loose connective tissue that are fluid filled spaces. That's your fascia. They're called interstitial spaces. And so when we want to activate the lung and large intestine channels, and those run on the top of the arm in the front here, yeah, you could do this fancy stretch. You could also do something that just simply opens the chest and bring your mind to this area, your breath to this area, and with your own intention, move the fluid in this area. So similarly, you could do all of these stretches in a chair. There are ways and methods to think, okay, here was the fascial plane, the outside of the arm, the side of the body, the front of the thigh, the back. And what I want to do is activate that area, breathe into it, and you will achieve the same effect as the fancy stretches. Okay, so there's one level of this practice, which is just feeling into the fascial plane, the general area. Then we have these stretches. You're not going to see me do these stretches looking like any of these, to be honest with you. My body, you'll see, And then I will offer a couple variations along the way, like that. Other than that, then we'll have a very important, just restful moment where we process and feel into this body. So this is a therapeutic practice in its own right. It's so helpful and effective for supporting of grief and pretty much everything else you could possibly think of and name, including just being a human. And little period of rest at the end is so helpful, as we learned in last class. Longer periods of rest are even more helpful. Okay, so with all that said, pop your questions in as they arise. We're going to go ahead and come to a standing position is where we're going to start our practice. So take your time. And I'm going to push this back a little bit so that you can see standing position. Now, let's catch the feeling that we want to get of movement, flow, activation. And this is a therapeutic practice in its own way of circulating fluid in the fluid spaces in the body. I've got a little bit of space between my feet. My knees are soft. This is my profile view. My knees are soft, so my hips are relaxed. Everything's relaxed. And what we're going to do is start bouncing. Now, I'm generating the bounce from my glutes, from my bum muscles, right? And I want to keep some of the weight distributed evenly around my feet so that not too much pressure goes towards the front of my feet. Sorry, not the front of my feet. I want to say not too much pressure goes to my knees, okay? And my arms are nice and relaxed, and I'm really making an effort here, an effortless effort to relax everything so that as I bounce, I'm going to feel this bouncing resonance through my whole body. And I'm going to maintain this for about a minute. 2 minutes would be really great. So the next time you're pumping gas or standing and waiting for a bus or the train, standing outside waiting for your ride share, you could totally just bop in a couple minutes of this. And what we're doing is very simply and successfully moving fluid in fluid spaces in the body. This is another wonderful movement for if you've been working at your desk, seated, we're all putting in mega Zoom time right now. Stand up, give yourself 2 minutes of this. And while you're doing it, just look around the room, right? Just kind of locate. Like, can you see something that's like the color red in the room? Just anything that makes you kind of get yourself a little bit expanded. The experience of grief is a very contractive experience. It's contracted and condensed. And what's so helpful is to get yourself expanded, and maybe now even expand if you have a window to look out of, like look out the window. Well, see a tree, see a bird, see maybe you're just seeing cars and buildings like myself, yes. So we're still going, we're still doing this little bouncy bouncy movement, and you kind of find a place where it's effortless, where it's just like you're bouncing, but are you bouncing? Make sure you're breathing also. And now just come to a stop. And close your eyes, keep the knees soft, and just bring yourself into your breath. And now we're inside this body, and I want you to feel, what do you feel, right? Tingling, movement, flow, warmth, coolness. These are the sensations of moving chi in the body, life force energy, prana, ki, chi in the body. So we want to capture a similar feeling when we're going to do these 5 elemental stretches of the sense of activation. So remember we said we're going to, so first up, metal. Lung and large intestine channels run on the top of the arm here, and they come up. The lung channel comes about here. The large intestine comes up here into the face, other side of the nostril. So we're thinking about this is the fascial plane in front. Now the fancy version of the stretch has us with a little bit of space between the feet. We're gonna clasp the thumbs and stretch through the index finger because the channels come through these 2 fingers, right? Again, these are all just options, it's not have-tos. And you're gonna hold that behind you. Let's say it's really hard to get the hands behind you, we need more space. Grab a sock, a towel, like a hand towel. Grab a yoga strap. Hold that behind you, breathe in. Exhale, forward fold. 3 to 5 breaths in each pose. Stretch through the index fingers. If you're holding the thumbs, come up. Breathe in as you come up so you don't get lightheaded. Switch the orientation of the thumbs. Breathe in. Exhale, forward fold. Stretch through the index fingers if that feels good. Breathe into the chest. Now breathe in as you're coming back up. Now a couple of breaths and observe that fascial plane that you wanted to activate. Same kind of sensations, openness, warmth, tinglies, even tinglies like as much as pins and needles feel. Heat, coolness, sense of flow, sense of activation. Now we're going to come down to the floor. So that's our one standing movement. So we did our shaking and bopping and jiving. Now we're going to come down to the floor. Earth phase. Fancy one has us in something like a seiza. Now this is a lot for the ankles, for the knees. Hands come behind we stretch back. Now, the picture shows somebody with some epically stretchy quadricep muscles that's able to lay it all the way down onto the floor. The idea here is these channels run on the front part of the body. So what are we after? We want this stretch on the front part of the body. Now, I do that stretch because I like that intense stretch for my quads, but this is the one that I do religiously, this variation. So we're gonna come into just 90 degrees with the front leg. Hips tilt forward. My left leg is down, my left arm comes up, and I'm just breathing into this front part of the body. So you could also be in a chair with one arm raised and this consciousness about this front part of the body. You might like to add a little bit of padding under that knee. 3 to 5 breaths. Really breathe. Breathe with that intentionality to be in the front part of the body. Now we did one side, so we need to switch, okay? Let's say you were doing the full expression of the stretch here. You might like to take a couple of breaths in child's pose. And for those of us doing variation, let's switch. Hips tilt forward, lots of space here in the glutes. My right knee is down, so my right arm comes up. And I'm just breathing. Feeling the front part of the body. Nice breath in. And coming down. Okay. We're gonna be down on the floor here, and we're coming into a seated position. And for me and my body, it is so much more comfortable if I have something under the bum, giving my hips a little bit of space, so that then I get a little bit better tilt of the hips forward, chest forward. If you're coming down onto the floor and you're finding yourself like your tailbone is really tucked under, grab something firm. If you use just like a fluffy pillow, it won't be as helpful. But grab something nice and firm. And we're going to come into something that looks like a butterfly pose. Now, I'm like wicked tight today. And this is it. This is all that's going to happen in this butterfly pose. And that's fine. Some of you may be able to bring your feet closer in, or as things get warmed up. We're doing the first of the fire face stretches. Now, the heart channel is here in the armpit, and it runs down the inside of the arm to the pinky. And the other channel we're going to access is the small intestine channel that runs on the outside of that surface. And then it comes and does some kind of zigzaggy moves at the shoulder blade. So what we're going to do is actually turn our hands to the inside and stretch under here in this butterfly pose. So it could be that you're going to bring your hands to the inside. We take a nice breath in and then come a little bit forward, leading with your elbows, and breathe. So I'm just meeting myself where I am today. Some tight business going on in those hips. And fire phase, you can get a pretty significant heat response, like feeling warmth in the arms all the way down to the pinkies. Okay, we're gonna follow with water phase stretch. The water phase channels of bladder and kidney run on the back side of the body, the whole back side of the body. And so this is going to look like a seated forward bend. This does not have to be the largest expression of the stretch, we just simply need to feel a sense of activation in the back body. Might also be really helpful to have something under the bum for support, for a little bit of space. We're reaching forward. We could reach for the toes. Breathe. Stretching for the back body. This could be a supported forward fold in a chair. This could be legs up the wall. We inhale up all the way down. Good. Right into, now remember, we had another fire face stretch, supplemental fire. Okay, one option is the legs are folded. Cross the arms. Stretching forward. Where are these channels? Again, up here, so pericardium channel. And then that's going to come right down the center, the inner line of the arm. And that triple heater channel's on the outside. The arm also comes up all the way up to the face. So what we want is the sense of a stretch around the shoulder blade, the outer shoulder, and then even this inner bit here. So this is one variation. Another variation has the legs folded one after the other and the arms out here with a forward fold. You may find that this gives you a little bit more space for bellies and boobs. Now, whichever version we're doing, legs folded like this, switch. Switch how the legs are folded. Switch whichever arm was on top, so a little switcheroo here. Don't forget to breathe. Now, we need a stretch for the pericardium, for that heart protector. So you're going to stretch your arms forward, draw them out, and then stretch your wrists. I call this your eagle wingspan. Now you might be a different raptor. You might be an owl. You might be a kite, a falcon. But me, I have the wingspan of a great bald eagle. Okay, most importantly is open up the wrist. Feel that stretch. This is so good also for computering. Stretch those forearms, stretch through all the way to the side of the chest. Feel that opening there. Relax your neck. No tension in the neck. Relax your shoulders. Your shoulders are down. And take a nice big breath in. And come all the way down. Last one. Wide leg. We've come to wood. Wood. Liver is the inside plane of the legs. Gallbladder is the outside, all the way up the sides of the body, all the way up the sides of the neck, all the way up the sides of the head. Let's take that forward fold first. Breathe in. And as you exhale a little bit forward and feel into some activation of the inner thighs. Keep breathing. Let's bring ourselves up. We're going to inhale, stretch the arms up, breathe in. And as you exhale, this is a side bend. Could be one arm stays on top of the thigh. side body stretch, or that elbow comes to the inside for a little extra rotation, side body stretch. Feel the whole outside rib cage, side of the neck. Inhale all the way up. Exhale, opposite side. Keep breathing. This could be a simple side bend in a chair. Inhale back up, stretch up, expansion and down. Find your way into a restful pose, either laying on the back, legs extended, arms extended, supporting the low back with knees bent. Seated meditative pose, but I do strongly encourage you to lay down. And if you wouldn't mind giving me that one last slide with a poem on it. This is a very important space here where we are feeling into the body and observing what we just did. So look for those signs of activation: tingling, flow, heat, cool. And now you have the whole body to observe. The whole body, because the brilliant thing about this body is that it is whole and complete. That it is not the sum of parts, rather it is systems, interconnected systems that work together to express and be in balance with one another. That balance isn't the goal actually, but really and truly the journey itself. So as you like, perhaps closing your eyes, this little soft sound in the background.
Connected to Yoli Maya's iPod and Yoli's MacBook Pro.
Don't listen to that lady. But she wants you to know that she's connected right now. Right. And I want you to connect in with your body. Find your breath in the belly. Remember, all these channels reside in the belly. And I want to share a final poem with you from this whole poetry series and this 5-part series. And this is just such a powerful poem by the great author Khalil Gibran. And this is called On Joy and Sorrow. So maybe just the eyes are closed and we're just listening. And if not, maybe you're tuning this out and you're just with your own body and experience, or pondering the joy of grief and what that means for you. A little something to share with you. On joy and sorrow. Then a woman said, "Speak to us of joy and sorrow." And he answered, "Your joy is your sorrow unmasked. And the self-same well from which your laughter rises is oftentimes filled with your tears. How else can it be? The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. It is not the cup that holds your wine, the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven. And is not the lute that soothes your spirit the very wood that was hollowed with knives? When you are joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find that it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy. When you are sorrowful, look again in your heart, and you shall see that in truth, you are weeping for that which has been your delight. Some of you say joy is greater than sorrow, and others say, nay, sorrow is the greater. But I say unto you, they are inseparable. Together they come, and when one sits alone with you at your board, remember that the other is asleep upon your bed. Verily, you are suspended like scales between your sorrow and your joy. Only when you are empty are you at standstill and balanced. When the treasure keeper lifts you to weigh his gold and his silver, needs must your joy or your sorrow rise or fall. So if we could just have that last slide. It has been a grand delight to share this idea. I shared, I think, 2 webinars ago, my own story of how I came to the realization of grief as a superpower. And thank you for hanging out with me these last 5 webinars. And many of you have shared these webinars with others. And please continue to share these resources with folks. I look forward to any of you that would love to be in touch. Feel free to reach out. My contact information is on these things. With that said, my approach in life is that whatever the answers that we seek, all we have to do is actually look in nature itself for the systems, for the design, for the answers. And so it has been a deep pleasure to share these resources with you all. And Alexandra, if there are any questions that I could attend to briefly, I would love to.
Well, first I need to say that was great. I didn't have enough space to get on the floor for the floor exercises, but I did like some of my own modifications, but I feel awesome.
Yeah.
And that is what has been echoed in the chat. There aren't any questions, but they're just statements saying this was very relaxing, excellent, that it was awesome. We have a first-time participant who really loved it. And so that's all that I have seen is just nothing but praise. There was also a comment earlier, I believe, from Tracy about the level of detail and how much they appreciate the level of detail that you present. So yeah, I don't see any questions, but I know I feel absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much.
Isn't that cool that like it could just be a little something, right? And in this whole series, we've done vocalization practices. We moaned like wildebeests. We shouted. If we would have more time to, we would do some laughter yoga. It doesn't take much, but I really think it's just about giving grief some space to be and cycle. Instead of being like, look, this is something I need to like get off the to-do list. Grieving done. Like I lost my job, done. We're on to the next thing. And it's not how we work as humans. It's actually just not part of the human experience to be that way. The mind is just really, really powerful. And whatever you tell it, it will believe.
Yes.
The mind is not the body. The mind is one part of this human physical experience that we have in this body. So we really have to center the body and then the expressions, the multitude of expressions that we have. But it doesn't take much. It could just be a little something. And I really want to also reiterate the power of rest. A minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes of just the intentional rest, putting the work down, putting all the demands down and holding that space. It is a radical, revolutionary act.
Yoli, I mean, I just agree with everything you just said. And I just want to let you know that how great this was, especially because I had some moments this weekend. I am actually in my 2nd month of grieving the loss of my mother. So this webinar, everything that you said, just the exercises, I just feel so much lighter and I really, really appreciate it. You have some more. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure hour for sure. Some more. Thank you so much.
Yay.
And so we're going to
sharing that, Alexandra. It's this pandemic has brought loss. I don't know anyone who hasn't been touched in some way in my work.
Definitely. It was so quick. You know, my mother died from brain cancer. Like we found out in June, she left in December. So it
Oh,
was so much to process. And me and her were
yeah.
very, very close. You have the body is the key in this processing. That's from Sophia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. If I'm not, forgive me. Siobhan said the idea of intentional resting is everything. Thank you for this. I think Jahira is going to go ahead and launch the poll.
Yes.
Perfect timing. And we can go to the next webinar. These are our English webinars. And for those who are joining us from Honduras, you can go to our website and you'll see the list of the webinars that we present, which is right after this webinar, and they're all in Spanish. So tomorrow, be ready, be Red Cross ready. Then we're gonna have NAMI, ending the silence, and you see the rest of the day. And then on Friday, Kathy will be leading us through difficult times. Next slide, please. And we want to do our hashtag amplify, right? We've been wanting to amplify the beauty, amplify what's great in the world. And so really we want to amplify right now what has been great about this webinar. So if you could put in the chat, hashtag something for me, I'll be hashtag be intentional about rest and grieving. That would be my hashtag. If anybody else has a hashtag, please put inside of the chat. Also, make sure that you share whatever you want to amplify in the world that's positive. Tag Be Strong Families on our social media page, and you can also email us. Next slide. Don't forget your mask. By getting a mask, you're also supporting this work that we do, particularly these webinars that we do as just a service and for free. We have one with the Be Strong Families logo, the other with hashtag amplified, amplifying respect and health. And so you'll see, you can find those at bestrongfamilies.org /resources. Abby said hashtag integrated healing. Thank you, Abby. And next slide. Last but not least, if you or you know someone, one of your colleagues, one of your friends that you think would have a great webinar to share, then make sure you email our CEO, Kathy, at bestrongfamilies.net. This is for the people, by the people. So if you know someone that has some great information or you're that someone, make sure you email Kathy. And then just want to thank you, Yoli, for a really great webinar. Thank you, Jahira, for being our tech support in the background. And this has just been great. I appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure. My absolute pleasure. And happy International Women's Day!
Yay!